The wind in Juniper Flats had teeth, and in the bruised twilight of late October, it was biting deep. It was a winter-fed thing, born on the high peaks of the Laramie Range and sent screaming across the Wyoming Territory with nothing to slow it but the bones of the land itself. It scoured the prairie floor, peeling back the dead summer grass to reveal earth cracked and fissured like the scales of a great, dry reptile, tumbleweeds, brittle skeletons of their former selves. Cartwheeled into the distance, their frantic dance the only sign of life in the vast, empty bowl of the landscape. The air itself tasted of frost and distance. Against this raw, elemental power, the sound was an impertinence, a sharp, rhythmic crack that defied the wind's lonely howl. Thump, scrape, thump. Marietta Vale drove another stake into the unforgiving ground. She was 25. Though the cold had pinched her face into something older and the labor had sculpted her frame into something harder than her years suggested. Her breath plumed white in front of her face, snatched away instantly by the wind. The heavy-headed mallet felt like a block of ice in her grip, even through worn leather gloves, and with every strike, a jarring shock vibrated up the bones of her arm. She ignored it. She ignored the burn in her shoulders and the ache deep in her back. She ignored the wind as it whipped strands of brown hair from her frayed ribbon, lashing them across her cheeks like tiny whips. Her world had been narrowed to the taut string she'd stretched between 4 corner posts, the raw, scraped rectangle that was the promise of a home. This foundation was not just wood and twine, it was a line drawn in the dirt, a declaration. I am here, I will remain. She didn't see him at first. He was just another part of the high country, a static shape on the ridgeline where the dying sun bled orange and purple into the clouds. A man on a horse, as common a sight as a hawk on the thermals. But he did not pass. He sat his horse, a powerful buckskin that stood rock still against the gale. And he watched. Rafe Calder watched the woman below, and a familiar irritation tightened his gut. He'd seen squatters before, drifters who mistook empty land for free land, who'd throw up a miserable lean-to only to be frozen out or starved out by the first real snow. He'd bought the surrounding parcels of Calder Mesa for a reason, paying good money for the silence and the solitude they provided. This particular square, the one bordering a southern pasture, had been fallow for years, a dead patch owned by some speculator back east who'd likely forgotten it existed. He had an offer pending on it himself. This was a complication. He urged the buckskin down the gentle slope, its hooves making soft, thudding sounds in the matted grass. As he drew closer, the irritation began to curdle into something else. She wasn't a drifter. Drifters didn't work like this. They didn't measure with string and level their stakes. They didn't have the relentless, metronomic rhythm of someone building to stay. The small figure was compact, wrapped in a man's oversized canvas coat, but there was no mistaking the stubborn set of her shoulders or the fierce concentration in the way she moved. She was fighting the land, the wind, the coming night, and from the looks of it, she was holding her own. He pulled his horse to a halt a dozen yards away. The jingle of the harness bit a sharp, metallic sound in the cold air. The hammering stopped. She didn't look up immediately, but he saw her whole body tense, a deer scenting a wolf. Slowly, she straightened her back, one hand rubbing the base of her spine, and turned. Her eyes were the color of the winter sky just before a storm, a deep and turbulent gray. They took him in from under the brim of a stained felt hat, the dusty boots, the sheepskin collar of his coat, the rifle resting in its scabbard, the hard set of his jaw. He saw the flicker of alarm, quickly suppressed and replaced by a flinty defensiveness. Rafe's voice, when it came, was a dry rasp. Unused for most of the day, it sounded like old saddle leather. Thought this parcel was empty. His gaze drifted from her face to the claim stake nearest him. It was new wood, freshly cut, with the initials MV carved into it. The cuts clean and deliberate. His eyes narrowed. This was no squatter. This was legal. Her chin lifted. Her voice was low but carried on the wind, each word spaced as precisely as the stakes she'd been driving. It's not, it's mine. She put a force behind the last word. Mine. That made it sound less like a statement of fact and more like a nail being driven into a coffin lid. It was the sound of ownership earned, not given. Rafe's gaze fell to her hands. Her knuckles were raw and scraped red, with slivers of wood embedded under her fingernails, a thin, white scar, pale as a sliver of moonlight, cut diagonally across the inside of her right wrist. A story he didn't know. The ribbon holding her hair back was a faded blue, washed so many times it was nearly white, the ends frayed into soft tassels. These were not the marks of a woman waiting for a husband to build her a home. These were the marks of a woman who had learned, likely the hard way, to be her own husband, her own carpenter, her own everything. The silence stretched, filled only by the sighing of the wind. An unspoken challenge passed between them. He was the established power here, the lonely king of this vast, empty space. She was the intruder, the disruption. He could make things hard for her. His land surrounded hers on 3 sides. His cattle could break her fences, if she ever managed to build any. His displeasure could poison her standing in Sandspur Ridge before she ever set foot in the town. He saw the knowledge of this in her eyes, and the defiant refusal to bow to it. With a soft grunt, Rafe swung a leg over his saddle and dismounted. The buckskin stood ground-hitched, impassive. From a leather tie behind his cantle, he unstrapped a small canvas sack and a heavy paper-wrapped parcel. He walked toward her, his stride measured, stopping a full 6 feet from where she stood. He set the items on the ground between them. The sack slumped with the weight of cornmeal. The parcel clinked with the sound of nails. "This isn't charity," he said, his voice still rough but stripped of its earlier challenge. "Surplus supplies. I've got more nails than I know what to do with." He set it to the ground, not to her. Then, pointedly, he took a step back, widening the space between them, giving her room to breathe, to choose. It was a gesture of respect, a quiet acknowledgement of the line she had drawn. A murder of crows burst from a stand of skeletal cottonwoods down by the creek bed. Their calls like tearing fabric. They wheeled against the darkening sky, a black vortex against the bruised purple clouds. Their passage brought a change in the air, a sharpening of the cold that carried the distinct, clean scent of imminent snow from far across the flats. On his own land, his herd of Hereford began to low, a deep, mournful chorus that was a sure sign of a coming storm. The world was closing in. Marietta's gaze dropped from his face to the offerings on the ground. Cornmeal, nails. The 2 most basic currencies of survival out here. She needed both, desperately. Her own supplies were meager, measured out to last until she could make a trip to town. A trip she couldn't afford to make until the cabin's shell was up. Pride was a luxury, a fire that warmed the spirit but did little for a freezing body or an empty stomach. Yet, accepting help was a kind of surrender, a crack in the armor she'd spent years building. She bent down, her movement stiff from the cold and the labor. Her gloved fingers closed around the box of nails, feeling their solid, practical weight. She left the cornmeal where it lay. She rose and met his eyes. She gave a single, sharp nod. It was a dry, ungracious thing, but it was an acceptance. It was the first, smallest concession. The people in Sandspur Ridge, the nearest collection of souls that could be called a town, had plenty to say about Rafe Calder. At the Copper Lantern Saloon, they'd say he was a man haunted by ghosts. He'd married young, a pretty, laughing girl named Ivy, and had lost her just as young to a fever that swept through the valley one brutal winter. After that, the life had gone out of him. He stopped coming to barn dances and Sunday socials. He spoke when spoken to, did his business at the general store and the livery, and then retreated back to the vast, empty loneliness of Calder Mesa. He bought more land not to expand his herd, but to expand his silence, pushing the borders of his solitude further and further out. He was a widower, a recluse, a man planting silence in the ground and waiting to see what would grow. Marietta knew none of this. She only knew the man standing before her was an unsettling presence. His kindness, however gruffly presented, was more dangerous than an open threat. A threat she could fight. Kindness she didn't know what to do with. "Don't be too kind," a voice whispered inside her head, a desperate plea. Kindness was a hook. It implied a future, a connection, a debt, all things she had come here to escape. Without another word, Rafe turned and swung himself back into the saddle. He gathered the reins, his movements economical and sure. For a moment, he looked down at her one last time, his eyes shadowed by the brim of his hat. Impossible to read. Then he nudged the buckskin into a walk, heading back the way he had come. Marietta stood motionless, the box of nails growing cold in her hand, and watched him go. She watched as his shape dissolved into the deepening twilight, a dark rider moving across a silvered landscape of frost-touched grass. He wasn't a threat, not in the way she'd expected. He was a question she hadn't been prepared to answer, hadn't even known to ask. The last of the sun's light vanished from the ridge. The wind grew sharper, carrying the first stinging flakes of snow. Shivering, Marietta turned back to her work. She picked up the mallet. The cold had sunk deep into her bones now, a weariness that went beyond muscle and sinew. But as she raised the tool, the sound it made when it struck the wood was different. The beat was still steady, still strong, but the angry, defensive edge was gone. It was no longer the sound of a woman fighting the world alone. It was the sound of a woman building a home, with a small, heavy box of someone else's nails resting by her feet. A new rhythm, hesitant and uncertain, had begun. Dawn broke not with a gentle blush, but with a sharp, silver crack across the eastern horizon. The cold of the night had settled deep into the earth, and every surface was limned with a delicate, crystalline layer of frost. Marietta's breath froze on the wool of her scarf, a fragile lattice of ice that shattered with every exhalation. She stood at one end of a long, heavy pine beam, her gloved hands finding purchase on the rough-hewn wood. At the other end stood Rafe Calder. He had arrived just as the first light was cutting through the gloom, a silent figure on his buckskin, leading a pack mule laden with tools and timbers that dwarfed her own small pile. There was no greeting, no discussion. He had simply dismounted, assessed the state of her foundation, and picked up a saw. Work was their only language. Now, they lifted. A silent nod from him was the only signal. The beam came up, heavy and obstinate. Marietta grunted with the strain, her boots sinking slightly into the hard ground as she took the weight. Her muscles screamed, but she held firm, shuffling sideways as he guided his end toward the corner posts. There was only the sound of their synchronized, shuffling feet, their grunts of effort, and the low, groaning complaint of the green wood as it settled into place. They were two bodies working as one, a machine of muscle and will assembled for a single purpose. Later, they were hoisting the ridgepole into position using a system of ropes and sheer manpower. The coarse hemp rope dug into Marietta's palms, and she felt a sharp, burning friction across her wrist. When the pole was finally secured, she let go, looking down at the angry red welt blooming on her skin. Before she could dismiss it, Rafe was there. He didn't speak. He simply held out a small, worn square of scrap leather. His eyes met hers for a fraction of a second, a silent command. She took it, her fingers brushing his, and a jolt of unexpected warmth passed between them. She wrapped the leather around her wrist, the worn softness a surprising comfort against her chafed skin. "Thank you," she said, the words barely a whisper, stolen by the wind. He gave a curt nod and turned back to the work. Their hands were a study in contrasts. His were large and broad, the palms thick with calluses, the knuckles scarred. His fingers were a map of hard labor, with deep, dirt-etched fissures at the joints that looked as if they might never come clean. They were powerful, capable hands, made for gripping an axe handle or the reins of a stubborn horse. Her hands, though equally calloused, were smaller, the fingers more nimble. There was a deceptive strength in their sinewy grip, a dexterity born from finer, more precise work in a life before this one. When they worked together on a task, His brute force and her focused agility found a strange and effective harmony. His strength set the timbers, and her eye trued the lines. They fell into a rhythm that required no words. A shared glance was enough to know when to lift, when to hold, when to let go. He would drive 3 nails with his heavy framing hammer, and then step back, nodding for her to take his place while he measured the next board. A single, dry cough from either of them meant stop. Something was wrong. The line was off. It was a language of labor, intimate and efficient, forged in the shared reality of sweat and sawdust. During a rare break, as they sat on a pile of lumber sharing water from his canteen, he finally spoke of himself, though his eyes remained fixed on the horizon, on the vast expanse of land that was his. He spoke of Calder Mesa not with pride or complaint, but with the flat, unemotional tone of a man listing inventory. 3 seasons of drought, back in 74 through 76 inches, he said, his voice a low rumble. Lost half the herd. The creek ran dry for the first time since my father settled this place. He paused, taking a long drink from the canteen. Then, a lightning fire in the summer of 77 took the north pasture and the main barn. We saved the house. He fell silent for a moment, and his gaze shifted slightly, toward a lone cypress tree that stood on a low hill, its dark form a stark silhouette against the sky. There's a white marker under that tree. He offered no more. He didn't speak the name Ivy. He didn't describe the fever or the grief that had hollowed him out. He simply stated the facts of his land drought, fire and a grave. It was enough. The hardships were etched into him as surely as the lines on his face. He looked at her then, a question in his eyes. Marietta did not offer her own story. Her past was a locked chest, and she had no intention of giving anyone the key. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a folded, oilskin-wrapped packet. She carefully unfolded it, revealing a hand-drawn map of her parcel of land. The lines were drawn in neat, precise ink. Measurements were noted in a small, tidy script in the margins. It showed the creek, the slope of the land, the position of the sun at midday. The boundary runs from that big rock down there, straight north for 560 yards, to the edge of the cottonwoods, she said, her finger tracing the line. The surveyor's notes were clear. She offered no tales of a failed dress shop in St. Louis or a faithless fiancé who saw her as another one of his pretty possessions. Her story was here, in these ink lines, in the claim she was working to make real. This map was her history and her future. A few times that day, riders from the neighboring ranches passed along the distant track that led to Sandspur Ridge. They would slow their horses, their figures small against the vast landscape, and stare. Marietta could feel their eyes on her, on the rising skeleton of her cabin, on the undeniable presence of Rafe Calder working beside her. She could almost hear the questions turning over in their minds, questions that would be carried into town and laid down on the sticky, beer-soaked bar of the Copper Lantern Saloon like a fresh hand of cards. The story of the recluse from Calder Mesa and the lone woman at Juniper Flats was beginning to be told, and they weren't the ones telling it. Rafe seemed oblivious to the distant eyes, but he wasn't. Marietta noticed it in the subtle ways he moved. While she was occupied fitting a window frame, she saw him walking the perimeter of her claim. He stopped at one of the corner stakes she had driven, a flimsy piece of dried poplar. He tested it with his boot, then pulled it from the ground with one easy tug. From the pack mule, he retrieved a thick, solid post of treated oak. With a heavy sledgehammer, he drove it deep into the earth, a solid, unmoving anchor. He did the same for the other 3 corners, replacing her hopeful markers with his own undeniable permanence. When he was done, he kicked dirt over the base of the posts to make them look as if they'd been there for some time. He never mentioned it, and she, noticing the dark, solid wood where the pale, flimsy poplar had been, never mentioned it either. It was a silent, unacknowledged gift, a fence built of respect. As dusk began to settle, bringing with it a deeper, more biting cold, they stopped. A small fire was the center of their world now, Marietta had a small supply of beans and bacon, and Rafe had brought a sack of potatoes and a pot for coffee. They cooked in near silence, the crackle of the fire and the hiss of bacon in the pan filling the space between them. She made a simple bean soup, and he roasted potatoes in the coals. They ate sitting on opposite sides of the fire, the heat a welcome relief on their aching bodies. When she reached for the pot to serve herself more soup, her knuckles brushed against his as he reached for the coffee. It was a fleeting, accidental touch, but a spark of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire shot up her arm. She pulled her hand back as if burned. He did the same. Their eyes met for a split second across the flames, and in that moment, the careful, practical wall between them shimmered, revealing something else, something unnamed and unsettling, before it solidified once more. The night deepened, bringing a sky so clear and black it looked like a hole in the universe, punched with the diamond-sharp glitter of 1,000,000 stars. From the high ridges came a sound that made the hair on Marietta's arms stand up, the long, mournful howl of a wolf, answered by another, closer this time, a primal fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her exhaustion. Rafe seemed unconcerned. He calmly stood up, walked to his horse, and pulled his rifle from its scabbard. He checked the action, his movements efficient and reassuring. He then grabbed several more thick logs and built up the fire until it blazed, casting a wide, protective circle of light and warmth around them. He gestured with his head toward the half-finished cabin, its one finished wall offering a slight break from the wind. "Get some sleep," he said. It wasn't a suggestion. She was too tired to argue. She wrapped herself in her bedroll inside the structure's meager shelter, the firelight flickering through the open studs. She watched him. He did not unroll his own blankets. Instead, he settled himself into a sitting position against the doorframe, his back to her, the rifle resting across his lap. He was a sentinel, a silent guardian posted between her and the vast, hungry darkness of the prairie night. Marietta woke just before dawn. The world was silent, bathed in a soft, gray light. A deep cold had settled into her bones, but she felt a profound sense of peace. She sat up, her movements stiff. Her first sight was of him. He was still there, slumped against the doorframe, his head resting on his chest, his hat pulled low. He had not moved all night. And there, on the dark felt of his hat, were tiny, perfect globes of dew, glittering like jewels in the pre-dawn gloom. They were proof of his long, cold vigil. It was a strange and powerful feeling, to be watched over so completely by a man who demanded nothing in return. It was a feeling of being cared for, but not owned. She rose quietly and went to the nearest of the upright support beams of the cabin. From a small pouch at her belt, she took a piece of chalk. On the rough, fragrant wood of the pine, she drew a single, firm, white line. It was a mark of survival. One more day she had endured. One more day her home had grown. But as she looked at the solitary mark, she knew it meant something more now. It was also a measure of the man sleeping in her doorway. It was a mark for the day Rafe Calder had crossed a line, leaving the solitude of his own land to help her build a life on hers. One day, one step closer. The town of Sandspur Ridge was a wound on the flat expanse of the prairie, a place that festered with suspicion and thrived on the boredom of its inhabitants. News of Rafe Calder's presence at the Juniper Flats claim spread faster than a grass fire. It started, as most things did, in the Copper Lantern Saloon. Elsie Dorr, a woman whose face was a roadmap of hard years and whose arms were thick with the muscle of hoisting kegs, wiped a greasy smear from the bar top. Buck Halley, a drover for the big railroad concern and a man who smelled perpetually of sweat and tallow, nursed a warm beer. "So," Buck began, his voice intended to carry, "I hear to tell our ghost of Calder Mesa ain't such a ghost no more." He grinned, showing a gap in his front teeth. "Here he's taken to helping that new woman out at the flats. Camping on her doorstep, they say." Elsie's rag stopped moving. Rafe Calder's business is his own, and hers is hers. "Oh, it's business. Is it?" Buck laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "That's a new name for it. Funny how a pretty face can thaw a man out. even one who's been frozen solid for 4 years. She'd best be careful. Calder, he don't stick. The men beside him chuckled, and the gossip, now greased and ready, slid down the bar, out the swinging doors, and into the dusty street. By Sunday, it had reached the pulpit. Pastor Whitcomb, a thin man with a gaze that always seemed to be searching for sin, gripped the edges of his lectern. Marietta sat in the back pew, her hands folded, her spine straight. She had come for solace, but found only judgment. The eyes of the other women, the wives of ranchers and merchants, were fixed on her, their faces closed and hard. "The good book tells us," Pastor Whitcomb's voice sliced through the still air, "that a good name is rather to be chosen than great riches. Honor," he said, his eyes scanning the back row, "is like a fence. It is a barrier against the wild. It protects the flock." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "But one must not, in foolishness or weakness, open the gate to the wolf. One must not invite corruption in, hoping to call it neighborliness." A murmur, like the rustling of dry leaves, passed through the congregation. Marietta felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she did not look down. She kept her gaze fixed on the pastor, her stillness a rebuke to his thinly veiled accusation. The world's judgment was one thing, the law was another. When she rode into town on Tuesday for supplies, a letter was waiting for her at the post office. It was from Pitkin Sons, bankers, in Cheyenne. Her fingers, stiff from the cold, fumbled with the envelope. The paper was thick, the script formal and cold. It stated in no uncertain terms that her title transfer for the Juniper Flats parcel was still pending review. No, a clause she did not remember from her original purchase papers was cited. Something about a timely judicial confirmation. It ended with a chilling sentence. "Should this delinquency persist, the bank reserves the right to reclaim the property for public auction." Reclaim. The word felt like a stone in her stomach. She had paid. She had the bill of sale, the receipts for every dollar she'd scraped together. What was pending? A problem. "Miss Vale?" The voice was smooth, like oiled steel. She looked up. A man stood before her on the boardwalk, blocking her path. He was dressed in a black wool suit, a stark and spotless figure against the town's dust. A gold watch chain looped across his vest. This was Silas Voss, the district manager for the railroad, a man who was rumored to own half the town, including, she was now realizing, the bank's local interests. He smiled, but his eyes were flat and cold, like a snake's. "I happened to be at the bank when your name was mentioned. Paperwork can be such a trial in this territory. It's a private matter. Mr. Voss," she said, folding the letter. "Of course, but perhaps," he continued, as if she hadn't spoken, "I can offer a simple solution. My railroad has a small, passing interest in your parcel. It borders our intended spur line. It would make an ideal spot for a water tower and storage." He named a sum. It was an insult, less than she had paid for the land outright. "Sell it to me. I'll handle the bank. You'll walk away with a clean profit. No more trouble." Marietta looked him in the eye. "The land is not for sale." Voss's smile tightened. "Just a fraction." He looked past her, his gaze sweeping the street, as if noting who was watching. He saw Rafe Calder's wagon, loaded with barbed wire, hitched outside the general store. His eyes narrowed. "A lone woman has a hard time holding on to things out here. Miss Vale," he said softly, his voice a purr that was more threatening than a shout. "The wind, the winter, the paperwork, it all wears you down. They're easily persuaded to change their minds." He tipped his hat. "My offer stands. For now." He walked away, leaving her with the bank's threat in her hand and his own hanging in the air. She felt the town's eyes on her as she crossed to the general store. Inside, Clara Finch, the town seamstress, was gossiping with the proprietor, her voice high and piercing, designed to be overheard. "And I told her, I said, it's a shame. That's what it is. First poor Ivy, God rest her. And then he just up and breaks it off with Sarah Henderson, sent the ring back by post. They say," Never even gave the poor girl a reason. He's a cold man. Rafe called her. He's not reliable. A woman would be a fool to—" Clara stopped abruptly as Marietta stepped up to the counter. The silence in the store was heavy and absolute. Marietta bought her flour and salt, her movements deliberate, her voice steady. She walked out into the sunlight, her purchases a heavy weight in her arms, but the gossip a heavier one in her heart. Rafe saw it all. He saw Voss speak to her. He saw the women in the store. He heard Buck Halley's laugh from the saloon. He said nothing. When she met him by her wagon, he simply took the heavy sacks from her and loaded them. He didn't ask about the letter. He didn't mention Voss. His public face was as impassive as stone, but his actions were not. He worked beside her for the rest of the week, his silence a comforting, solid presence. While the town talked, Rafe worked. He said nothing when he found her fence line weak, but the next day he returned with his own wagon of thick cedar posts and stretched new wire, his pliers twisting and pulling with a contained, angry strength. He built a windbreak against the north wall of her cabin from scrap timber, a solid defense against the coming storms. He kept his silence in public, but in private. He was mending her fences. On Sunday, Marietta went to church. It was an act of defiance. She had baked a loaf of bread, and when the donation plate was passed, she walked to the front and placed it on the altar table. Pastor Whitcomb, standing there, looked at the loaf, then at her. He hesitated, his hand hovering. His eyes darted to the open doorway. Rafe Calder was standing outside on the porch, his hat in his hand, his gaze fixed on the pastor. He was not in the church, but he was present. With a tight jaw, Pastor Whitcomb snatched the loaf and turned away. The next blow came 2 days later. It arrived with the mail rider, who handed her a second envelope from Pitkin Sons. It had come impossibly fast, as if sent by telegraph and hand-delivered. Rafe was there, helping her set the ridgepole. He watched her open it, saw the color drain from her face. "What is it?" he asked. It's a final notice," she whispered, her voice shaking. "It says the bank's primary investors are concerned about the claim's instability. It says I have 10 days to appear at the county seat in Larkspur with a judicial seal on the original deed, or they will begin foreclosure proceedings. 10 days. Primary investors," Rafe said, the words like chips of ice. He took the letter from her trembling hand. "Voss, he's not just squeezing you. He's trying to steal it." Marietta sank onto a pile of shingles, the fight draining out of her. "I don't understand. I paid. I have the receipts." "The receipts don't matter if the title isn't legally filed with the county. He found the loophole. Marietta." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears of pure frustration. "He thinks I'm just some fool he can scare off." The admission was torn from her, a confession of the fear she'd kept locked away. "This land, it's not just land. Rafe, it's everything. I saved for 5 years. I worked in a photographer's studio in Dodge. I mixed chemicals, cleaned the glass plates until my hands bled. The owner, he was a gambler. He fled his debts and left me the deed to this place as payment. He said it was worthless. It's not worthless." She took a shaky breath. "But the transfer, it was never stamped by the county judge. I never had the fee for the filing. Not until this spring. I thought I had time. I thought I could build the cabin first." Rafe stared at the letter, his jaw working. The wind whipped at his hair, but he seemed not to feel it. He was a man of the land. He understood the treachery of paper and ink. "Larkspur," he said finally. "That's the county seat. It's a 2-day ride from here. Hard going." Marietta shook her head, a wave of hopelessness washing over her. "I can't. The cabin's not finished. The storm and I have to buy the calves." "The cabin can wait," he interrupted, his voice firm. He looked at her, his gaze cutting through her excuses. "My man, Ain, can watch your new stock. He owes me a favor." "But your own herd," she protested weakly. "Annie needs to—" "Annie will do as I say." He knelt in front of her, forcing her to meet his eyes. His gaze was not gentle, but it was steady. It was the truest thing she had seen in months. This isn't about the calves, Marietta, and it's not about the roof. Voss and that banker are trying to rob you in broad daylight, using the law to do it. You need to face that judge." He paused, his voice softening just a fraction. "And you need someone standing beside you when you do." The words hung between them. He wasn't offering to save her. He was offering to stand with her, to be her witness, to lend his name, his presence, his silent, solid reputation to her fight. He was offering to stand against the town, against the railroad, and against the ghosts that haunted them both. She looked at the cabin, the solid walls they had raised together. She looked at the new fence line, strong and taut. Then she looked at his hand, resting on his knee, a hand that was calloused and scarred from work, a hand that had asked for nothing from her. She took a deep breath and let it out. The tremor was gone from her voice, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "All right, Rafe, we ride for Larkspur." It was not a promise of love. It was not a romantic declaration. It was an alliance. A compact of two. A single, defiant front against the world that was trying to tear her down. They would go, not as lovers, but as partners. They rode out at first light into a world of brittle silence. The Tarnish River, a churning, muddy artery in the summer, had been choked by the cold. A skin of mottled, pockmarked ice stretched from bank to bank, thick enough to hold their weight, but not thick enough to quiet the unnerving groans of the water moving sluggishly beneath it. They crossed the old wooden bridge, and with every step their horses took. The timbers groaned and popped in protest, the sound unnaturally loud in the frozen air. Marietta kept her eyes fixed on the far side, her knuckles white where she gripped the reins. The bridge felt like a promise that could break at any moment. The land beyond was a brutal, rolling emptiness that stretched to the horizon, a monotonous landscape of dun-colored grass and sagebrush dusted with frost. The trail to Larkspur was little more than a suggestion, a pair of ruts carved by the occasional wagon. The wind was their constant companion, a relentless, physical force that pushed against them, stealing the warmth from their coats and the breath from their lungs. By mid-morning, the sky ahead didn't darken. It turned a malevolent shade of ochre. Rafe pulled his horse to a halt. His eyes narrowed against the horizon. "Dust," he said, the single word, a grim pronouncement, "and coming fast." It was upon them in minutes, not a gentle haze, but a solid, rolling wall of earth. The world dissolved into a blinding, stinging chaos of grit and wind. It was a physical presence, a scouring powder that got into the eyes, the nose, the lungs. It was impossible to see, to breathe, to think. Marietta pulled her scarf up over her mouth and nose, hunching low over her horse's neck. But the thin cotton was a pitiful defense. The wind howled in her ears, and the grit felt like it was grinding her skin from her bones. Suddenly, a shape materialized beside her. It was Rafe. She could barely make out his form through the swirling curtain of brown. He was unwrapping the thick wool scarf from his own neck. He leaned across the small space between their horses, his movements sure and steady even in the maelstrom. He wrapped the scarf around her head, pulling it down over her hat and tying it firmly under her chin, covering her nose and mouth. For a moment, her face was buried in the thick, warm wool. It smelled of him of leather, clean sweat, and the faint, cold scent of the high country. It was an island of warmth and solidness in the middle of the storm. He gave a quick, reassuring touch to her shoulder, then vanished back into the brown gloom. She rode on, breathing in the faint traces of his scent, the fabric still holding the warmth of his body against her frozen cheeks. An hour later, as quickly as it had come, the storm passed, leaving them coated in a fine layer of dust that turned their clothes and skin the color of the earth. They were both coughing, their throats raw. The landscape was the same, yet altered, as if a dirty blanket had been shaken out over the world. They reached the Willowgate relay station in the late afternoon. It was little more than a sod-roofed stable and a one-room cabin, smelling of manure, old leather, and boiled coffee. An old man with a beard stained yellow with tobacco juice and a permanent squint emerged from the cabin, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. "Calder," he grunted by way of greeting. Figured this wind'd blow something in. His eyes, small and bright as a magpie's, shifted to Marietta, taking in her dusty form with frank curiosity. "Silas," Rafe replied, swinging down from his horse. "Need to water the horses, maybe some of that coffee, if it ain't strong enough to dissolve a horseshoe." Inside, the cabin was cramped and close, heated by a pot-bellied stove, as Silas poured 2 mugs of thick, black coffee. He talked. "You hear about Voss?" he asked, not waiting for an answer. "The railroad man, he's been buying up every scrap of land that touches the survey line, paying pennies on the dollar to folks who are scared. Folks who ain't scared." Silas paused, taking a long, noisy slurp of his coffee. "He's got ways of making 'em stubborn. A fella over on the Sweetwater, he wouldn't sell. Woke up one morning. His well was fouled. Nothing to be proved, of course, but the fella sold." Silas looked directly at Marietta. "It's a hard country for a person on their own, especially if they're sitting on something that a rich man wants." The warning was as clear and sharp as a shard of glass. They rode on, the old man's words hanging in the cold air between them. The sun was sinking, painting the underbellies of the clouds in shades of bruised apricot and rose. They needed to find shelter for the night. Rafe led them off the main trail, following a ridge until they came upon a small, derelict hut, half hidden in a copse of wind-stunted pines. It was a linesman's shack, long abandoned, a tombstone of a shelter against the coming night. Inside, it was dark and smelled of decay and pack rats, but the walls were solid, and the roof, while sagging, looked mostly intact. They built a small fire in the crumbling stone hearth, a fistful of light and warmth in the vast, cold darkness. They ate a meager meal of hard biscuits and jerky, the silence between them comfortable now, forged by the shared hardships of the day. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, a polite and proper distance between them, but the warmth of the small blaze seemed to shrink the space, drawing them closer in spirit, if not in body. Marietta stared into the flames, the firelight dancing in her eyes, the journey, the warning from Silas, the constant pressure it had worn down her defenses. She found herself speaking, her voice quiet, almost lost in the crackle of the fire. "I was engaged once," she said. The words surprised her, as if they had come from someone else. Rafe didn't look at her, but she saw his whole body go still, listening. His name was Mr. Albright. He was a merchant in St. Louis, very handsome, very successful. He owned a beautiful house with glass cabinets filled with porcelain figures from France. She picked up a small twig and poked at the embers. "He wanted to put me in one of those cabinets. He bought me silk dresses and pearl earrings. He liked to show me off to his friends at dinner parties. I was to be his finest acquisition." She gave a small, humorless laugh. "One day, I looked at my reflection in the glass of one of those cabinets. I saw the silk dress and the pearls, and I saw a woman I didn't recognize, a stranger with empty eyes. I realized I wasn't an ornament for his mantelpiece. I was a person." She snapped the twig in two and tossed the pieces into the fire. "That night, I took off his ring, I packed my bags, and I walked away. I never looked back." The fire crackled. The wind moaned around the corners of the hut. Rafe was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low rumble, and his eyes were also fixed on the flames. "My wife, Ivy," he began, and the name, spoken aloud, seemed to hang in the air like a ghost. "She loved wildflowers, Indian paintbrush, and wild blue flax. People said this land was too hard, too dry for anything delicate to grow, but every spring she would go out with a little cloth bag of seeds, and she would scatter them in the pastures and along the creek bed." He looked up, and for the first time his gaze met hers across the fire. There was a profound sadness in his eyes, but also a quiet strength. The first year, only a few bloomed. The drought took most of them, but she went out again the next spring, and the next, every year. No matter how hard the winter, some of them always found a way to come back, stronger, brighter. He looked away, back into the fire. She never tried to fence them in, she just gave them a chance to grow. He didn't speak of her death. He didn't have to. He had told Marietta everything she needed to know. He had loved a woman for her resilience, not her beauty. He had admired her for her stubborn will to survive. A sudden, violent gust of wind slammed against the hut. The whole structure shuddered. The makeshift chimney coughed out a puff of smoke and a shower of glowing red embers. Rafe moved in a blur. He shifted his body, angling himself to shield her as a cascade of hot ash blew from the hearth. She felt a brief, stinging heat on her sleeve, but his broad back took the worst of it. The danger was over in a second, but he remained where he was. Close. The space between them had vanished. She could feel the heat radiating from his body. The wind howled through a crack in the wallboards, a knife of icy air cutting across her back. "I need to warm my back," she said, her voice a little breathless. She shifted, just a few inches, until her back was pressed against the rough log wall, and she was sitting beside him, not touching, but close enough to feel the solid presence of him, close enough for her heart to begin a slow, heavy beat against her ribs, a drum she was sure he could hear. The silence was different now. It was charged, electric. He reached inside his coat and pulled out a small, pewter flask. He uncorked it and offered it to her without a word. Their fingers brushed as she took it. It was like the accidental touch at the campfire, but this time it was not accidental. It was a current that flowed between them, holding them in a moment of suspended time. The air was thick with the scent of mint from the whiskey and the sharp, clean smell of burning pine. She took a small sip. The whiskey was a fiery warmth that spread through her chest. She handed the flask back to him. He took a drink, his throat working. Then, slowly, deliberately, he turned his head and looked away from her, out into the darkness beyond the single, unglazed window opening. He was holding onto propriety with both hands, a man clinging to a code of conduct in the middle of a wilderness that had none. Marietta didn't look away. She looked at the strong line of his jaw, the tension in his neck. She saw the battle he was fighting with himself, the rigid control he was imposing on a feeling that was as wild and untamed as the wind outside. She understood the code he was trying to honor, and in that moment, she respected him for it more than she could say. Eventually, the fire burned low, and the exhaustion of the day settled over them. They did not unroll their bedrolls side by side. He took the wall by the door, and she took the one by the hearth. They lay down with their backs against the rough planking. Two solitary figures in the dark. From far off in the distance, a sound drifted on the wind. Thin and lonely, the whistle of the night train. Heading east, it was a reminder of the world beyond this hut, the world of lawyers and judges and men like Voss. It was a reminder that this peace, this fragile connection forged in a storm and sealed by a fire, was only temporary. The last of the embers in the hearth glowed a dull, angry red. Rafe's voice came out of the darkness, quiet but firm, a promise. "In the morning," he said, "to the courthouse. Say it all, sign it all." The Larkspur County Courthouse was not a temple of justice. It was a simple, two-story clapboard building, the largest structure in town, and it smelled of fresh ink, damp wool, and the accumulated dust of 1,000 petty disputes. The courtroom itself was a single, large chamber paneled in pine that had yellowed with age. Sunlight streamed through tall, wavy glass windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air. At the front, on a raised dais, sat Judge Theron Caro, a man whose stern, unyielding face seemed carved from the same granite as the mountains that loomed to the west. He wore a pair of simple iron-rimmed spectacles perched on a beak of a nose and wielded a gavel with a handle worn smooth and dark from years of use. Marietta and Rafe sat on a hard bench near the front. She clutched a small, grease-stained oilskin pouch in her lap, her entire life story contained within its worn folds. Rafe sat beside her, a silent, solid wall of a man. He did not look at her or at the judge. His gaze was fixed on the double doors at the back of the courtroom, and his jaw was set in a hard, unforgiving line. He was waiting. He didn't have to wait long. The doors swung open, and Silas Voss entered as if he were stepping onto a stage. He was flanked by two men in identical black suits, their faces pale and predatory. They moved with the oily confidence of men for whom the law was not a shield for the innocent, but a club to be wielded by the powerful. A representative from Pitkin Sons Bank, a nervous, sweating man named Finch, scurried in behind them like a rat in the wake of a wolf pack. A low murmur rippled through the assembled crowd of ranchers, merchants, and town gossips who had come to witness the spectacle. Judge Caro banged his worn gavel once, a flat, dead sound that cut through the noise. "This court is in session. We are here to hear the petition of Miss Marietta Vale for the judicial confirmation of deed for the parcel known as Juniper Flats." He peered over his spectacles at Voss's legal contingent. "And I see the interested parties have arrived." Voss's lead lawyer, a man with a booming voice and a smug smile, stepped forward. "Your Honor, Mr. Hayes, representing the interests of the Wyoming Pacific Railroad, and by extension, the primary investors of Pitkin Sons Bank. We are here to contest this petition based on a significant clerical error, a date of filing discrepancy. To be precise, the original deed, as you will see, lacks the requisite county stamp within the legally mandated period. As such, the bank holds the prior lien. He presented a sheaf of papers with a flourish. Judge Caro took them, his expression unreadable as he scanned the documents. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with the weight of legal jargon and veiled threats. "Miss Vale," the judge said, his voice dry as dust. "Your response." Marietta stood. Her legs felt unsteady, but she locked her knees. She walked to the front of the room, placing her oilskin pouch on the witness stand. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clearer and stronger than she'd expected. "I don't know about date discrepancies. I only know what is true." She untied the pouch and laid its contents out. There was the original deed, creased and worn. There were the receipts from the Dodge City Land Office, detailing her payments. And there was a small, leather-bound ledger. "This," she said, her hand resting on the book, "is the record of my labor. Every post I cut, every nail I purchased. Every day I have worked to improve that land. That land is not just a name on a piece of paper. Your Honor, it's the sweat from my back and the calluses on my hands." She spoke simply, without emotion, but her words filled the room with the undeniable truth of her struggle. Then she fell silent. "Mr. Calder," the judge called. Rafe rose and took the stand. He did not look at Voss or his lawyers. He looked at Judge Caro. "You are familiar with this parcel?" the judge asked. "I am," Rafe replied. "My land borders it on 3 sides. And in your estimation, has Miss Vale made improvements to the property?" She has laid a foundation, framed walls, and established clear and proper boundary markers." Hayes, Voss's lawyer, rose to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Calder is not a certified surveyor." "I am not," Rafe agreed, his voice a low growl. "But I know where my land ends and hers begins. I know the stone markers that have been there for 20 years, and I know that her new fences run true to those markers. I also know that the creek she draws water from is the same one my cattle drink from, as per the water rights attached to that deed." He spoke in short, precise sentences, each one a nail driven into the heart of their argument. He was not speaking of law. He was speaking of the land, a language he knew better than any man in that room. Hayes sneered. He turned his gaze on Marietta, his eyes sweeping over her with a calculated insolence. "Your Honor, if I may," he began, his voice dripping with insinuation. "It is indeed a touching story. A lone woman, struggling against the elements. It is almost romantic." He paused, letting the word hang in the air. "One might wonder at Mr. Calder's intense interest in his neighbor's affairs. He has provided her with materials. Has he not with labor?" He took a step toward Marietta. "Tell me, Miss Vale, is your close association with the wealthy and powerful owner of Calder Mesa a part of your improvement plan? Is his patronage perhaps another form of collateral?" A collective gasp went through the courtroom. It was a vile, poisonous attack, a smear of tar intended to stain her character and undermine her claim. Rafe went rigid in his seat, his hands clenching into fists so tight his knuckles turned white. For a moment, it looked as if he might launch himself over the railing, but before he could move, Marietta stood up, her back ramrod straight. She faced Hayes, and the look in her eyes was like a shard of blue ice. The courtroom, which had been buzzing with whispers, fell deathly silent. Every eye was on her. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the silence like a razor. "My honor," she said, each word distinct and perfectly formed, "is not for mortgage." The silence that followed was absolute. Hayes's smug smile faltered. He had overplayed his hand, and he knew it. He had tried to paint her as a fallen woman, and instead, she had revealed herself to be a lady of unshakable integrity. The whispers that started now were of a different kind, murmurs of respect, of admiration. Judge Caro cleared his throat, his eyes hard behind his spectacles. "That is enough, Mr. Hayes. This is a courtroom, not a saloon." He looked from the bank's papers to Marietta's ledger. "There is a clear conflict here. The law requires a stamp. Equity requires a consideration of the facts on the ground." He leaned forward, his gaze sweeping the room. "Therefore, this is my ruling. I will place a temporary seal on this deed, maintaining the status quo. No action can be taken by the bank or any other party to seize or alter the property." A sigh of relief escaped Marietta's lips. "However," the judge continued, raising a hand to quell the murmurs, "this is not a final judgment. I'm ordering a 10-day period for a full and proper survey and a physical inspection of the property by a court-appointed agent. At the end of those 10 days, we will reconvene, and I will make my final ruling." He banged the gavel. "Court is adjourned." It was a victory, but a fragile one. A reprieve, not a pardon. As they filed out onto the sun-drenched courthouse steps, Voss moved to intercept them. He ignored Rafe completely, his cold eyes fixed on Marietta. He leaned in close, his voice a low, conspiratorial hiss. "You're a fighter, I'll give you that. But 10 days is a long time. The wind blows hard out at Juniper Flats. You'll get tired, and when you're tired, you'll sell." Marietta didn't flinch. She met his gaze without blinking. "I have strength left, Mr. Voss." He smiled his snake smile and walked away, his lawyers trailing in his wake. "He won't stop," Rafe said, his voice grim. "He'll use these 10 days. "I know." She looked at her own hands, still trembling slightly from the ordeal. "There's so much to do. The roof, the walls." "You can't do it alone," Rafe said. It was a statement of fact. "Not in 10 days. I'll hire a couple of my men to help you. We can have the shell up and weatherproofed in a week." She looked up at him, her pride warring with the practical, overwhelming truth of his words. "I can't accept. It's not a gift." He cut her off, his eyes intense. "It's an investment in a good neighbor." "No," she said, her voice firm. "If I accept, it will be as an employer. I will pay them their daily wage. I'll sign a note for it, to be paid when I sell my first calves." She needed this to be clear. A transaction, not a rescue. No debts, no obligations, no room for gossip. A slow smile touched the corners of Rafe's mouth. A rare and surprising sight. "Done," he said. The news of their stand at the courthouse spread through Sandspur Ridge on the afternoon stage. By evening, it was the only topic of conversation. They stood together, people said, a note of wonder in their voices. The town, which had been so quick to judge, was now intrigued, ready to see which way the wind would blow. That night, Silas Voss sat in the back room of the Copper Lantern, a glass of whiskey in his hand. Buck Halley stood before him, twisting his hat in his hands. "I want you to ride out to Calder Mesa," Voss said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Don't let anyone see you. I want you to look around. See how his operation is running. Find a weakness, a sick calf, a broken fence, a disgruntled hand. Every man has a weakness. Buck, I want you to find his." Buck nodded and scurried out. He returned 2 days later, his report grim. "There ain't no weakness, Mr. Voss. The fences are the best I've ever seen. The herd is strong, The new calf's healthy. He runs that place like a fortress. Every man has a weakness, Voss repeated, his voice a low hiss. Well, Buck said, shifting his weight. There is the woman. He's spending all his time out at her place. His own work is getting behind. Some might say his heart's not in his own business no more. Voss stared into his whiskey, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. His heart, he whispered. Yes, perhaps you found it after all. As Marietta and Rafe rode back toward Juniper Flats, the 10-day clock ticking in their minds, the wind began to shift. It swung around to the north, carrying a deep, biting cold and the unmistakable, metallic scent of a coming blizzard. But underneath that clean, cold smell, there was something else, something acrid and unsettling carried on the gusts. It was the smell of smoke where there should be no fire. The first sign of trouble was not a sound, but a light, an angry, flickering orange that pulsed against the blackness of the midnight sky, painting the inside of Marietta's half-finished cabin in hellish, dancing strokes. For a moment, half asleep, she thought it was a monstrous sunrise. Then came the sound, a low, hungry roar, punctuated by the sharp crackle of burning timber, and the smell, acrid and choking, of smoke and burning hay. It was a sound that bypassed the ears and went straight to the heart, the roar of a freight train bearing down on you in the dark. She was on her feet in an instant, her heart slamming against her ribs. The small barn, the shelter she'd built for her handful of newly purchased calves and her winter feed, was a torch against the prairie night. Was it a stray spark from the chimney, a coal tossed by the rising wind? Or was it a hand, a deliberate, malevolent act? There was no time to wonder. The flames were consuming the dry wood with a terrifying speed. As she burst from the cabin door, a thunder of hooves ripped through the night. A horse and rider crested the nearby ridge, silhouetted for a moment against the terrible light before plunging down the slope at a reckless gallop. It was Rafe. He must have seen the glow from his own ranch house miles away. He leaped from the buckskin before it had even skidded to a halt, a bucket in one hand and an axe in the other. There were no words. There was no plan. There was only the fire. They became a frantic machine of survival. He hacked at the primitive well cover while she found her own buckets. They formed a desperate two-person brigade, sloshing water that seemed to hiss and vanish into steam the moment it touched the flames. The heat was a physical blow, blistering their faces and scorching their lungs. Smoke billowed around them, a thick, greasy cloud that turned every breath into a rasping cough. The calves. Marietta screamed over the roar, her voice raw. Rafe didn't hesitate. He tossed the axe aside and plunged toward the burning structure. He kicked open the jammed side door and was swallowed by the smoke. Marietta followed, her scarf pulled over her mouth, her eyes streaming. Inside was a vision of chaos. Terrified calves bawled, their eyes wide with panic. Huddled against the far wall away from the encroaching flames, Rafe was a demon in the swirling embers, his knife a flash of silver as he sawed through the thick hemp ropes of their tethers. Smoke coiled in Marietta's hair. Soot and ash rained down, clinging to Rafe's sweat-soaked cheeks, drawing dark, tribal lines on his skin. As he freed the last calf, he shoved it toward her. "Get them out!" She grabbed the terrified animal, half pulling, half carrying it out into the relative safety of the night air. As she turned back, she saw a flicker of movement at the edge of the firelight, near the dark line of the cottonwoods. A man, a skulking shadow, turning to run. It was a fleeting glimpse, but in the chaotic, pulsing light of the fire, she saw him stumble. For a split second, his boot sole was visible as he scrambled for purchase on the frosty ground. There was something odd about it, a metallic glint. Then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness. "Rafe!" she shrieked. Someone was here, but her warning was drowned out by a great, groaning sound from above. The main support beam, eaten through by the fire, was giving way. The roof was coming down. Rafe was just staggering out of the doorway, his lungs heaving, his eyes red and raw. He looked up, saw the collapsing inferno, and then he saw her, frozen in its path. He moved with a speed that seemed impossible, covering the ground between them in 2 long strides. He didn't shout. He simply grabbed her, pulling her hard against his chest and spinning them both around, his back taking the brunt of the fiery shower of sparks and collapsing timbers. The world became a roar of sound and a blast of suffocating heat. She was crushed against him, her face buried in the rough wool of his coat, which smelled of smoke and horse and the clean scent of the man himself. She felt the impact as debris rained down on his back. A ragged, broken cough was torn from her lungs. She felt his hand, firm and steady, patting the space between her shoulder blades. A strange, gentle gesture in the middle of the chaos, grounding her, helping her find her breath. And then, silence, or something like it. The fire still raged, but the immediate danger had passed. The roof was gone. A black, gaping maw opened to the star-dusted sky. The wind, which had fed the flames, now began to die down, as if its work was done. The only sound was the crackle of the dying fire and the frantic, hammering beat of 2 hearts, his and hers, pounding against each other like war drums after the battle is over. They stood locked together for a long moment. The world narrowed to the circle of his arms. Slowly, he loosened his grip, his hands moving to her shoulders to hold her steady. "Are you hurt?" he rasped, his voice rough with smoke. She shook her head, unable to speak. She was trembling, a deep, uncontrollable shudder that came from the very core of her. It was the cold of the night air on her sweat-dampened skin. But it was something more. It was the aftermath of terror, the raw, unvarnished recognition of how close she had come to the end. Inside the cabin, the air was still thick with the lingering ghost of smoke. The fire in the hearth, which Rafe had banked before he left, now seemed a small, tame thing compared to the inferno outside. He sat her down on the single wooden chair, then dipped a clean rag into the water bucket. He knelt before her, his movements gentle, deliberate. He began to wash the soot from her face. His touch was incredibly soft, a stark contrast to the calloused roughness of his hands. He cleaned a smudge from her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. She shivered again, a violent tremor, and his eyes met hers, filled with a question. It was the cold, yes, but it was also the newness of this, the profound intimacy of this simple, tender act. No one had touched her with such care in a very long time. They were standing by the hearth now, the warmth of the fire a welcome balm on their chilled skin. The soft, golden light played across the planes of his face, softening the hard lines around his eyes and mouth. It caught the delicate curve of her collarbone, exposed where the collar of her shirt had fallen open. Rafe's hand, the one that still held the damp rag, was frozen in the space between them, a breath away from her skin. He had finished cleaning her face, but he had not moved away. The air was thick with unspoken things, with the adrenaline of the fire and the stark reality of their shared survival. The careful distance they had maintained, the walls of propriety and caution, had been burned away in the blaze. All that was left was this raw, trembling awareness. Marietta looked at his hand, then up into his eyes. Her own voice was a whisper, a ragged thread of sound woven from smoke and fear and a desire so sudden and powerful it stole her breath. "Kiss me there again," she begged breathlessly. He didn't need to ask where. He knew. His eyes darkened, and he leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She didn't. He pressed his lips to the corner of her mouth, where a last, faint smudge of soot remained. It was a soft, tentative kiss, tasting of ash and cold air. Then he moved, his lips tracing a slow, deliberate path along the sharp line of her jaw to the soft skin beneath her ear. He followed the curve of her throat, his breath warm against her chilled skin. They were not frantic, hungry kisses. They were long and deep, and filled with a reverence that made her heart ache. Each one was a question, an exploration, a discovery. His hand came to rest on her shoulder, his fingers just brushing the bare skin of her neck. He stopped there, his thumb stroking her gently, his eyes asking for the permission his lips would not, in answer. She raised her own hand and covered his. She didn't push it away. She guided it. She drew his hand down the length of her arm. A slow, deliberate journey over the worn fabric of her sleeve. She brought his calloused palm to rest over her heart, pressing it flat against the frantic, hammering beat beneath her ribs. Her breath hitched. His own breathing was a harsh sound in the quiet room. It was an answer, a silent, solemn agreement. Her body's language was a clear and unequivocal yes. He wrapped his other arm around her waist, pulling her flush against him, and his mouth found hers again. It was a passionate, consuming kiss now, yet still gentle, still tender. It was a kiss that honored a boundary, a celebration of nearness that stopped at the sacred line of devotion and respect. In the middle of the kiss, a sound escaped her, something he had never heard before. A laugh. It was not a sound of humor, but of pure, unadulterated joy, a crystalline note in the smoky air. He pulled back slightly, a look of wonder on his face. "Marietta," he whispered, her name a prayer on his lips, and he kissed her again. They ended up sitting on the floor before the fire, his arm still around her, her head resting on his shoulder. Their foreheads were touching, their breath mingling in the warm air. "I was scared," she confessed, the words a small admission of a vast truth. His arm tightened around her. "I'm here," he answered. Two simple sentences, spoken with the weight and finality of an oath sworn in the wild. The night wrapped them in a blanket of warmth and quiet promises. There was no further physical act, only the profound intimacy of two souls, stripped bare by fire, finding shelter in one another. As the first, pale light of dawn began to filter through the cabin's single window, they knew they had to separate. The world, and their fight, was waiting. He stood, pulling her to her feet. He looked down at her, his face serious in the gray light. He cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking the skin he had so carefully cleaned. He leaned down and gave her one last, lingering kiss. It was a kiss that held the memory of the night and the promise of the future. As he pulled away, his eyes held hers. "Don't regret this," he said, his voice low and firm. It wasn't a question. It was a command, a plea. In the cold, gray light of dawn, the ashes of the barn were a sodden, smoking wound on the land. Rafe moved through the wreckage, his face a mask of cold fury. He knelt by the spot where Marietta had seen the figure stumble. The frost had preserved the partial print, and the melting ice from their buckets had cast it in sharp relief. It was unmistakable. The heel of a boot, with a single, star-shaped metal cleat driven into the center. "A-frame cleat," Rafe said, his voice a low growl. "For grip, but that star that's custom, that's vanity." "Who wears something like that?" Marietta asked, her arms wrapped around herself. "Someone who works the rail yards," Rafe said, standing up. "They use them to walk the icy boxcar roofs, and there's a man who practically lives at rail yard storage number 3, Buck Halley." The name hung in the air, thick with the oily smoke that still clung to them. Buck Halley, Voss's dog, investigation, frontier style, was not about procedure. It was about knowing where to kick the ant hill. Their first stop was not the deputy's office, but the Copper Lantern Saloon. Elsie Dorr was swabbing the bar, her face grim. "Heard what happened?" she said, not looking up. "Animals." "Buck Halley," Rafe said, his voice flat. "Was he in here last night?" Elsie's rag stopped moving. She looked up, her eyes sharp. "No, not last night, but he was in here 2 nights ago, flashing more money than a drover's got a right to have." "What'd he say?" Marietta asked, stepping forward. Elsie snorted, a sound of pure disgust. "He was drunk, bragging. Said he'd finally got paid for handling a patch of stubborn weeds. Said some folks just needed a little fire to help him see reason. I thought he was just flapping his gums." Her eyes met Marietta's, filled with a sudden, cold understanding. "Looks like I was wrong." That was all they needed. They went to Deputy Higgins, a lanky, quiet man who had the thankless job of keeping the peace in a county owned by men like Voss. Higgins listened, his face impassive, as Rafe and Marietta laid out the facts, the print, the motive, Elsie's testimony. "It's a strong smell, Rafe," Higgins said. "But it ain't a body. I can't arrest a man for bragging in a saloon." "Then don't arrest him," Rafe said, his eyes like chips of ice. "Just listen. Buck's a fool. He spends his money as fast as he gets it, and he spends it all at the same place." That night, Rafe and Higgins took up a position in a dark, cold alleyway across from the Red Garter, the saloon and dance hall where Buck Haley was a nightly fixture. They waited for hours, the cold seeping into their bones. Finally, just before 1 in the morning, two figures emerged, silhouetted against the gaudy red light of the doorway. It was Voss, his form stiff with anger, and Buck Haley, stumbling and whining. They stopped right outside, Voss grabbing Buck by the front of his shirt. "You brainless oaf." Voss's voice was a low, vicious hiss, but it carried clearly in the still, cold air. "I paid you to scare her, not to bring the whole county down on my head, you and your clumsy, fiery mess." "I did what you said," Buck pleaded. It got away from me. Mr. Voss, but she'll sell. She's got to sell now." "She's not selling, you fool." Voss spat. "She's at the courthouse, and now Higgins is sniffing around. You made a worthless mess, and it cost me good money." That was it. Higgins stepped from the alley, his shotgun held level. "Mr. Voss, Buck, fancy seeing you two out so late." Voss's face went pale, then contorted with rage. Buck looked like he was going to be sick. "Deputy, this is a private conversation." Voss snapped. "It is." Higgins agreed, his voice mild. "A private conversation about arson, conspiracy. And let's see." He grabbed Buck's arm. "Buck, I'm arresting you on suspicion of setting the fire at the Vale property. And Mr. Voss, I'd be real careful where you go." They hauled Buck to the jail. His boots, stained with mud and soot, were sitting by his cot. Higgins turned one over. There, in the center of the heel, was a single, star-shaped cleat. The match was perfect. Faced with the evidence, the boot, and the deputy's grim silence, Buck Haley folded like a cheap suit. He confessed everything, signing a statement that named Silas Voss as the man who had hired him, paid him, and given him the kerosene. Voss, however, was a cornered snake. He struck back, not with fire, but with ink and whispers. He couldn't be arrested on Buck's word alone. He was too powerful for that. So he went to war. He had his lawyers file a motion to dismiss Buck's confession as coerced. Then he turned his poison on Marietta. The rumors started within a day. They were insidious, spreading from the saloon to the general store, whispered by the very women who had eyed her in church. Marietta Vale wasn't a brave homesteader. She was a clever opportunist. She was leaning on Rafe Calder, using his sympathy and his wallet to do her work. She was a woman of loose character, entertaining the lonely widower in her half-built cabin in exchange for his protection and his resources. The story was crafted to strip her of her agency and her honor. Worse, Voss attacked her livelihood. Marietta needed to prove intent to ranch to satisfy the court. That meant livestock. When she went to the livestock agent to purchase the small herd of breeding calves she'd saved for, the price had suddenly, inexplicably, doubled. "Sorry, Miss Vale," the agent said, not meeting her eyes. "Market's tight. A big buyer from the railroad, well, he's just snapping up all the available young stock, driving the price up." Voss was trying to strangle her, to make it impossible for her to meet the judge's requirements. She returned to the cabin, defeated for the first time. Rafe found her staring at the empty, newly built corral. "He's going to win," she said, her voice hollow. "He's buying all the calves." Rafe's jaw was tight. "No, he's not." The next day, Rafe sold 20 head of his own best spring calves. He sold them at the far end of the county, to a third party, for a price that was criminally low. 2 days after that, the third party, a rancher Rafe trusted, Arrived at Juniper Flats with a small herd. "Got some surplus stock, ma'am," the rancher said, tipping his hat. "Heard you were in the market. I can let 'em go for the price I paid." Marietta looked at the calves, then at Rafe, who was pointedly fixing a hinge on the new barn door. She understood immediately. She walked over to him. "This is charity." "Rafe, I won't." "It's not," he said, not looking up from his work. "It's a business transaction. You need stock. I need to thin my herd. You'll sign a note." He pulled a folded paper and a pencil from his shirt pocket. Promissory note. For the full, fair market value of those calves, before Voss started his games. Due in 2 years with interest. It's all legal and binding. It's a loan, not a gift. He was protecting her, not just from Voss, but from the gossip. By insisting on a formal, written debt, he was giving her the power. She was his debtor, not his dependent. She took the pencil, her hand steady, and signed her name. But Marietta was not a woman to be rescued. While Rafe had secured her herd, she was securing his conviction. She rode to Sandspur Ridge, not to the saloon, but to the blacksmith's shop. She found the smith, a burly German named Schmidt, and placed Buck's boot on his anvil. "Did you make this?" she asked. Schmidt squinted at the star. "Yeah, I did, for that fool, Buck Halley. He wanted to be Einstein. A star. Paid extra for it. Stupid." Marietta had him sign an affidavit, his big, blocky signature attesting that he, and he alone, had made that cleat, and he had made it for Buck Halley. The chain of evidence was now a shackle. The final public confrontation happened at the monthly livestock auction. Marietta was there, registering her new brand. Voss appeared, all smiles and false concern. He cornered her by the cattle pens, in full view of half the county. "Miss Vale," he said, his voice loud enough for all to hear, "I feel this animosity between us has gone on long enough." He held out a piece of paper. "This is a contract, a final offer. I'm willing to buy your land for a generous price, far more than it's worth. Let's end this unpleasantness. We can be friends." It was a performance. He was offering her a way out, painting himself as the reasonable, generous party, and her as the stubborn fool. It was a proposal meant to humiliate her, to frame her as unreasonable if she refused. Marietta looked at the contract. She looked at Voss's smiling, reptilian face. Then she looked at the crowd watching them. She took the paper from his hand, and with 2 quick, deliberate motions, she tore it in half, and then in half again. She opened her hand, and the small white squares scattered on the wind, like a flock of startled sparrows. Voss's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of pure fury. The public humiliation was total. He had misjudged her. "You'll regret that," he seethed, his voice low. "I will see you in court, and I will see you ruined." "I'll be there," Marietta said, her voice clear. As Voss stormed off, the crowd's murmuring changed. They had seen the bully, and they had seen the woman who wouldn't back down. The tide of opinion, so easily swayed by gossip, was beginning to turn. That evening, Rafe and Marietta stood by her new, smaller barn. The 10-day inspection was only 3 days away. "I need to ask you something," Rafe said. "When we go to that inspection, when the judge is there, I want to stand with you, publicly, as your partner in this." She looked at him. The new barn, the new calves. She knew what he was offering. He was offering to tie his good name, his reputation as a solitary but honorable man, to hers, the one the town had tried so hard to tarnish. "Are you ready for that?" "Rafe," she asked, her voice soft. "Are you ready for the slings and arrows? They'll say everything." He looked at the cabin, the home they had built. Then he looked at her. "I've lived with silence long enough. Marietta, it's a cold companion. I'm ready to speak." A knock on the doorframe interrupted them. It was Deputy Higgins, holding a telegraph slip. "A wire from Judge Caro," he said, a rare smile on his face. "He's received my report, Buck's signed confession, and a sworn affidavit from Mr. Schmidt the blacksmith." He handed the paper to Marietta. "He's impressed. He's moving the on-site inspection up to tomorrow." They both looked up at the sky. The wind had shifted again, and the clouds on the horizon were a heavy, bruised purple. The air was thick and wet, and the first massive, wet flake of snow drifted down, melting on Marietta's cheek. The last late-season storm of the year was rolling in, a final, impartial judge, set to arrive on the exact same day as the law. The snow was not a gentle dusting. It came in horizontal, wind-driven sheets, stinging any exposed skin and blurring the world into a howling vortex of white and gray. The survey party, a small, grim knot of figures, huddled against the gale. Judge Caro, his face wrapped in a wool scarf until only his iron-rimmed spectacles were visible, led the way, followed by Deputy Higgins, Silas Voss, and his lawyer, Hayes. Rafe and Marietta walked side by side, their shoulders braced against the wind as if it were a physical opponent. They reached the Dry Fisher Gulch, the boundary line at the heart of the dispute. It was a 15-foot deep scar in the earth, its sloping sides now slick with a treacherous layer of ice and new snow. "The deed states," Higgins shouted over the wind, reading from the document, which flapped violently in his grip. "The boundary runs 100 yards south of the high water mark of the Dry Fisher seasonal watercourse." "And that," Voss interjected, his voice sharp, "is a ditch, not a watercourse. The nearest high water mark is 50 yards north, which, as you can see, would place this cabin squarely on railroad property." The court-appointed surveyor, a nervous man named Phipps, tried to set up his tripod. He fumbled with a plumb line, but the wind snatched the brass bob, swinging it in a wild, useless arc, a pendulum for a broken clock. "Your Honor, I can't get a true vertical of the wind." "Then we'll use a true horizontal," Rafe said. He and his foreman, Ain, who had followed with a wagon, moved forward. They were carrying a heavy, flat stone, a slab of granite nearly 3 feet wide. The original survey coordinates marked the corner here. With a grunt, they heaved the stone and set it onto the frozen bank, its weight crushing the ice. Carved deep into its surface were 2 letters MV. Caro stepped forward, bracing himself against the wind. He pulled a compass from his pocket, checked it against the map, and then looked at the stone. He stomped his boot, clearing snow from the ground beside it, revealing the rotted, half-buried stump of the original surveyor's stake. "The marker is new," Caro pronounced, his voice carrying with judicial finality. "But its placement is consistent with the coordinates on the original plat. It stands." Voss surged forward. "This is an outrage planted." A furious gust, more violent than the rest, ripped across the gulch. It tore the surveyor's map from his board, sending it cartwheeling into the white chaos. As Phipps lunged for it, he stumbled, crashing into Marietta. She was standing on the slick, icy slope of the bank. Her feet went out from under her. She cried out, a small, sharp sound, as she began to slide toward the bottom of the gulch. Rafe moved. It was not a thought, but an instinct. He took one long stride, his boots finding purchase where hers had not, and his arms shot out, locking around her waist. He pulled her back, hard, her body slamming into the solid wall of his chest. He held her there for a second longer than was necessary, his body shielding hers from the wind, his chin pressed against the top of her snow-caked hair. "I've got you," he breathed, the words for her alone, shaken. She steadied herself but didn't pull away. Instead, she reached into her own oilskin pouch. "Your Honor, I have evidence of the time." She produced the small, faded photograph. It was stiff with cold. "This was taken the day I first saw this land, before I'd even driven a stake. That's me standing by the original marker." She pointed to the faded image of herself, then to the spot where Rafe's new stone now sat. "But the proof is the shadow." She held the photo up, angling it against the weak, watery sun that was just a pale disk behind the snow. "You see the shadow of the stake in the photo. It points directly at that cluster of iron-red rocks, given the time of day, just past noon. It proves this was the corner, exactly where Mr. Calder placed the stone. It was brilliant, A truth captured in silver nitrate. A moment frozen in time that defied all legal argument. Caro squinted, looking from the photo to the rocks and back. He nodded, a sharp, satisfied gesture. Voss saw the judge's expression. He saw his case dissolving. He took an angry step forward to protest, his face dark with fury. "This is a circus, a photograph." He was not watching his footing. His expensive, smooth-soled boot hit the same patch of treacherous ice Marietta had. He yelped, a high, undignified sound, as his feet flew out from under him. His arms flailed, and he went down, sliding awkwardly on his back toward the frozen ditch. He was just out of reach. Rafe looked down at him, his face impassive. Then, with a sigh of what looked like pure annoyance, Rafe took a step, braced himself, and shot out his hand. He grabbed the front of Voss's expensive wool coat and, with one powerful, impersonal yank, hauled the sputtering man back onto solid ground. He set Voss on his feet, brushed the snow from his own glove, and stepped back. Wordless, the entire crowd, the townspeople, Elsie Dorr, even Pastor Whitcomb, who had all ridden out to witness the judgment, saw it. They saw the man who held the woman with fierce, protective tenderness, and they saw the man who, with cold disdain, saved his enemy from a fall. The moral compass of the prairie had just been laid bare. Judge Caro had seen enough. He'd seen the land, the map, the proof of the photograph, and the character of the men before him. He pulled the deed from his coat. From his saddlebag, he produced a heavy, self-inking stamp. He leaned down, spread the document flat on the new stone marker on the carved initials MV, and slammed his fist down on the stamp. Thump! The sound was sharp and absolute in the snow-muffled air. The coordinates match, the labor is proven, the claim is validated, Caro declared, his voice cutting through the wind. He folded the paper and handed it, not to his deputy, but directly to Marietta. Sovereignty of this parcel, known as Juniper Flats, is lawfully and fully vested in Miss Marietta Vale. It was over, a victory as hard and real as the stone beneath their feet. The crowd of onlookers was silent. They looked at Voss, who was brushing snow and humiliation from his suit, his face a mask of thunder. They looked at Marietta, her hand closed tightly around the stamped deed. The whispers began, but the tone was entirely new. It wasn't derision. It was a grudging, undeniable respect. One by one, they turned their horses and began the slow ride back to Sandspur Ridge, their minds already spinning a new and very different story. Marietta let out a long, shuddering breath she felt she'd been holding for a year. Her eyes were bright, the snowflakes melting on her lashes. She turned to Rafe. He wasn't cheering. He wasn't boasting. He was just looking at her, a slow, deep smile transforming his face, a smile of such profound, quiet pride that it warmed her to the bone. He reached out, his heavy glove covering her hand, the one that held the deed. He gave her wrist a single, firm squeeze. "You did it." They rode home in the thickening snow, the world reduced to a soft, white cocoon. The victory was a quiet, glowing coal inside her chest. The cold was sharp, and her hands, even in her gloves, were numb. She nudged her horse, Daisy, closer to Rafe's buckskin. Without a word, she pulled her right hand from its stiff, icy glove. In a gesture of simple, trusting intimacy, she slid her cold, bare fingers into the open cuff of his heavy wool coat, burrowing them against the warm skin of his forearm. He didn't flinch or pull away. He didn't even look. He just let her hand rest there, his body heat flowing into hers. A silent, shared comfort that was more binding than any word. They reached the cabin. The new, smaller barn stood strong against the storm, but there was a figure waiting for them. A man on a half-frozen horse, his shoulders thick with snow. It was the mail courier, on his last run before the storm shut everything down. "Miss Vale," he shouted. "Got a federal pouch for you from Cheyenne." He handed her a stiff, official envelope, its corners damp. A new, cold dread, sharper than the wind, cut through Marietta's victory. She opened it with her numb fingers. It was a formal summons. Silas Voss had gone over Judge Caro's head. He had filed a petition with the Federal District Court, a public domain reclamation and rezoning request. He was arguing that her parcel, by virtue of its border with the railroad's right-of-way, was essential for national expansion under a federal charter. The fight wasn't over. It had just moved to a bigger, more dangerous arena. She looked up from the paper, the snow stinging her face. Rafe was watching her, his smile gone, his eyes hard again. They were going to have to go to Cheyenne. They were going to have to face this. And before they rode into that final battle, they both knew, in the silence of the falling snow, that they would have to decide, once and for all, exactly what they were to each other. The snowstorm had sealed them in. It was a fortress of silence, the drifts piling high against the new walls of the cabin, the wind a low, mournful howl in the chimney. The world outside had ceased to exist. Inside, the only sounds were the steady pop and hiss of the logs in the hearth. The air was warm and thick with the scent of pine smoke and the lingering aroma of boiled coffee. They had eaten in near silence, the weight of the federal summons from Cheyenne a cold, hard stone on the table between them. This fight was no longer about a few acres. It was about the unstoppable, crushing power of the railroad and the United States government itself. Marietta sat at the table, the firelight catching the auburn strands in her hair. She ran her fingers over the stiff, official paper, then pushed it aside. She unrolled her own hand-drawn map, the one with her precise, inked lines, now stained with dirt and water. She smoothed it flat. Beside it, she placed the deed Judge Caro had stamped. The map was her past hope, the deed her present victory. The summons was the threat to both. She had spread her entire life on the table, as if opening her chest for his inspection. "He wants to erase me," she said, her voice quiet, almost swallowed by the wind's howl. "Voss doesn't just want the land. He wants to prove I was never here." She looked up at him, her eyes dark with a weariness that went deeper than the day's labor. "It's what I've always been afraid of, not the cold or the hunger, but of being a footnote in another man's story." Her confession hung in the air, a raw and simple truth. "When I was in St. Louis, I was Mr. Albright's fiancé. He saw me as a porcelain figure for his glass cabinet. When I first came here, I was that lone woman on the flats. When you started to help, I became Calder's woman." She looked at him, her gaze unflinching. "I am so tired of my whole life being defined by the man standing next to me. I am tired of being his property, or his burden, or his shame." Rafe had been sitting across from her, the firelight carving deep shadows on his face. He watched her for a long, still moment. He didn't offer an easy comfort. He didn't tell her she was wrong. He stood up, the legs of his chair scraping loudly on the rough floorboards. But he didn't walk away. He moved the chair around the corner of the small table. Placing it next to hers, he sat down, not facing her, but beside her. Now, they were both looking at the map. They were both facing the fire. "I don't want to face off against you, Marietta," he said, his voice a low rumble, as steady as the stones of the hearth. "I want to walk in the same direction. Your name is your own. I just want to be the man who gets to walk beside you, not in front and not behind." His words settled over her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a different kind of promise. She turned her head, her shoulder brushing his. He was so close, the smell of him of wool, clean sweat, and the faint, sharp scent of the snow filled her senses. A tremor, one she had been fighting all night, ran through her. It was the cold, it was the fear, and it was a sharp, aching desire that she had no name for. Slowly, she lifted her hand from the table. She laid it on top of his, where it rested on his knee. His skin was rough, his knuckles calloused, his hand large and warm. He went perfectly still. She saw his throat work as he swallowed. She didn't speak. She let her body talk. She closed her fingers around his hand and guided it. She let him. She lifted his hand from his knee and brought it to her own body, pressing his warm, rough knuckles to the hollow of her collarbone, right where the pulse in her throat beat a frantic rhythm. She let him feel the shiver that ran through her skin. He understood. His eyes, dark and intense, locked with hers. He leaned in, his breath fanning her cheek. He kissed her, not on the mouth, but at the corner of her eye. It was a touch as light as a snowflake. He moved to her temple, his lips incredibly soft. "Marietta," he whispered against her skin, the sound of her name a physical touch. He kissed the delicate curve of her ear, and his breath hitched. She felt him counting her breaths, or perhaps he was teaching her to match his, a slow, a deep rhythm that steadied her. His other hand came up, not to grab, but to frame her jaw, his thumb stroking the smooth line of her cheek. His hand, the one she had guided, remained at her collarbone. His fingers were a breath away from the edge of her simple wool shirt. He stopped there. He waited. In the flickering light, his eyes asked the question. She gave him the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. Yes, he accepted her answer. His fingers moved, but not in the way she had braced herself for, not with the clumsy hunger of other men. His touch was a slow, warm exploration. He traced the line of her shoulder, his touch mapping the shape of her beneath the fabric. His fingers moved down her arm, over the worn wool of her sleeve, a warm, definite path that sent a jolt of liquid fire through her veins. He was learning her, not taking her. He was honoring the boundary, and in doing so, he was claiming her more completely than any man ever had. The sensation was so profound, so intensely respectful, that a small, breathless sound escaped her. She needed him to know. She took his hand, the one on her arm, and pulled it to her chest. She pressed his palm flat against her ribs, against the wild, heavy thudding of her heart. She held it there, forcing him to feel the storm he had unleashed inside her. Her voice was a rasp, a desperate, breathless plea. "Kiss me there again." He did. He kissed her mouth, and it was a kiss of shared strength, a promise sealed. They stayed like that for a long time, the wind howling its lonely song outside, the fire dying to a bed of glowing embers, the fight with Voss, the federal court, the snow, it all faded, leaving only the reality of the small, warm space they had carved out for themselves. They finally pulled apart, just enough to breathe. They rested their foreheads together. A small laugh, a puff of shared air, escaped them both. The tension was gone, replaced by a deep, solid certainty. "Tomorrow," he whispered, his eyes still closed. "In that courtroom. They'll say what they said before. About us. They'll try to use you and me against each other." "Let them," she whispered back, her voice finding its strength. "Tomorrow, in front of God and the federal judge, we'll tell them exactly what we are. But tonight, the heart gets to answer first." He pulled back, his gaze serious. "My answer, it's complicated. Marietta." He looked into the fire, and the familiar shadow of his past crossed his face. When she passed, I didn't just grieve. I bolted the door. I thought I was honoring her. I built walls of silence, and I thought that was strength." He turned back to her, his honesty a raw, painful thing. "This loneliness, it isn't just for her. It's fear. I've been terrified of this. Of letting anyone in. I was afraid that if I ever did, I'd just be looking for her ghost, that I'd spend my life comparing, and that I'd turn a new, living woman into a shadow of a memory. I was afraid of loving wrong, of failing again." His confession was the key to the man he was. He was not a man haunted by grief. He was a man terrified of his own broken heart, afraid it would break another's. Marietta reached out, her fingers, no longer trembling, touching his rough cheek. She made him look at her. "I am not Ivy," she said, her voice clear and strong, an anchor in his storm. "She planted flowers in the rocks. I build walls and dig wells." A short, rough laugh escaped him. "I know that. And you," she continued, her gaze holding his, "are not Mr. Albright. You're not the men from my past. You're not a merchant who wants to put me in a glass case. You're the man who pulled me from a fire and who waited for me to nod." She took his hand. "We are not our ghosts. Rafe. We are not their stories. We are two new names, Marietta and Rafe, and that is who will be in that courtroom tomorrow. The decision was made. It was a pact, a second, truer deed. We ride for Cheyenne at dawn, he said, his voice firm. The doubt burned out of it. You, as the plaintiff who won her case, and me as your partner. Publicly. Publicly, she agreed. The word was a vow. He stood and pulled her to her feet. He walked to the cabin door, the solid plank of pine he had hung himself. He looked at the simple wooden latch. From the sheath at his belt, he drew his skinning knife. "Rafe, what are you doing?" He didn't answer. He held the latch steady and with strong, sure strokes, began to carve into the wood. His letters were deep and plain. He wasn't carving MV or RC. He carved two words, Juniper Home. He ran his thumb over the fresh-cut grooves. It's not my land. It's not your land. It belongs to the junipers and the wind. It's just home. He stepped back, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. They were a single unit. They were ready for the final battle. But far away, in a smoke-filled room in Cheyenne, Silas Voss was sliding a heavy canvas bag across a table. The men he was talking to were not lawyers. They were hard cases, railroad toughs with dead eyes and scarred knuckles, the kind of men hired to break strikes and clear squatters by any means necessary. "I don't care about the legalities," Voss hissed. "She cannot be in that courtroom, and Calder, he needs to be taught a permanent lesson about interfering with progress. Do you understand?" The leader of the men picked up the bag, weighing the gold inside. He smiled, a cold, empty gesture. "For this, Mr. Voss, we understand perfectly." The federal courthouse in Cheyenne was a place of stone and shadow. It was built to impress, to awe, to remind a man of his smallness in the face of the law. Heavy velvet drapes, the color of dried blood, hung over towering windows, and a great solemn flag with 38 stars drooped from a pole. Its silence a heavy presence in the room. The air smelled of old paper, floor wax, and the cold, metallic scent of power. Silas Voss swept into the chamber not like a defendant, but like a conquering general. His new lawyer, a man imported from Denver, was his opposite thin, pale, and dressed in a frock coat so black it seemed to drink the light from the room. Voss was here to project an image of untouchable influence. He sat at his table and arranged his papers with a calm, predatory confidence. Marietta and Rafe sat at the plaintiff's table. They looked small in the cavernous room. Two weathered figures from the high plains brought into a world of polished mahogany and subtle threats. But they were not bowed. They sat straight-backed, their hands resting on the table, a silent, united front. The federal judge was a man named Elias Thorne, a veteran of the war with a face that looked like it had been carved from a block of seasoned oak. He wasted no time. "Mr. Voss," he began, his voice a gravelly baritone that filled the room. "This court has reviewed your petition for reclamation. It has also reviewed the findings of the Larkspur County Court, including the confession of one Buck Halley. You may present your case." Voss's lawyer rose, his voice a smooth, cultured purr. "Your Honor, the confession is irrelevant. It was coerced from a simpleton. Our case is not about a barn fire. It is about national progress. The Wyoming Pacific Railroad has a federal charter to expand. Miss Vale's parcel is a geographic and strategic impediment. We are here to ask the court to exercise its right of eminent domain for the greater good of the nation." It was a brilliant, cold-blooded strategy. He was attempting to make Marietta's deed, her labor, her very existence, irrelevant. But they were ready. When it was their turn, they did not argue philosophy. They presented facts. They laid out their evidence like a hand of winning cards, one by one. For the judge and the silent, watching gallery to see. First, the boot print, preserved in a plaster cast by Deputy Higgins. "The star cleat, Your Honor," Higgins testified. "Custom made by the Sandspur blacksmith." Second, the blacksmith's sworn affidavit, confirming he had made the cleat for one man, and one man only, Buck Halley. Third, Buck's signed confession. The lawyer scoffed. But the words on the page, detailing the time, the place, and the payment from Voss, were damning. Fourth, Marietta's photograph. Evidence of the original survey marker's location. Your Honor, she stated, her voice clear and steady. A truth captured by the sun itself. Fifth, Rafe's stone marker. With the initials MV carved deep. A new marker on an old spot, Rafe said, his voice resonating with quiet authority. A line that has been respected for 20 years. With each piece of evidence, a subtle shift occurred in the courtroom. The foundation of Voss's case, built on influence and arrogance, was beginning to crack. Suddenly, a commotion erupted from outside, a series of loud shouts, followed by the frightened whinny of a horse. The clerk rushed to the window. Your Honor, there's a disturbance on the street. A group of men, railroad workers by the look of them, they're trying to block the entrance to the courthouse. Voss's face remained a mask of indifference, but a flicker of triumph showed in his eyes. His hired thugs had arrived, but his triumph was short-lived. From the back of the courtroom, Deputy Higgins, who had been standing guard, gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to someone outside. Through the tall windows, the scene on the street became clear. A line of hard-faced men on horseback had moved to intercept Voss's thugs. They were Rafe Calder's men, his foreman Ain at their head. They formed a solid, silent wall of horseflesh and grim determination. With Deputy Higgins directing them, they uncoiled lariats, stretching a thick rope barrier across the street. It was a simple, effective piece of frontier ingenuity. The law and the land, standing together, inside. Voss knew he was losing. He played his last, desperate card. He rose to his feet. Your Honor, he said, his voice ringing with false sincerity. This is what I speak of. This woman has brought nothing but conflict. She has bewitched a good man, a respected rancher, and tied him to her scandal. She has turned neighbor against neighbor. Rafe stood up slowly. Permission to speak. Your Honor. Judge Thorne nodded. Rafe did not look at Voss. He looked at Marietta. I am not here because I was tied, he said, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. I'm here because I was chosen. I chose to stand by a woman of honor who was being robbed, and she chose to let me. He turned his gaze to the judge. That's not a scandal. Your Honor, in the part of the country I come from, we call that a partnership. It was done. The truth, plain and unvarnished, had been spoken. Judge Thorne looked at Voss, his eyes cold. Mr. Voss, this court finds your petition for reclamation to be not only without merit, but to be a malicious and predatory action, filed in bad faith. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. Petition denied. A collective gasp. Then a burst of applause erupted from the gallery. Furthermore, the judge continued, his voice rising over the noise, based on the evidence presented, this court is referring the matter of the arson at Juniper Flats and your potential involvement to the federal prosecutor's office. He slammed his gavel down. You are a disgrace to the spirit of this territory, sir, and your days of bullying honest folk are over. Voss stood frozen for a moment, his face a mottled canvas of shock and fury. Then, with a strangled cry of rage, he spun on his heel and stormed toward the doors. Shoving his own lawyer aside, he threw the heavy doors open and burst out onto the courthouse steps, nearly colliding with Marietta, who was just stepping outside. You, he spat, his face contorted. Before he could say more, Rafe was there. He moved with a fluid, deadly grace, stepping in front of Marietta, pulling her behind him. His hands shot out, not to strike Voss, but to grip the front of his coat, stopping him cold. Rafe's eyes were the color of a thunderhead, dark and dangerous. Get away from her, he said, his voice a low, lethal promise. Voss, for the first time in his life, looked truly afraid. He wrenched himself free and stumbled down the steps, disappearing into the crowd. The wind howled on the courthouse steps, whipping the fine, dry snow into their faces like a spray of salt. Marietta stepped out from behind Rafe, tilting her face up into the storm. Her eyes were wet, but not from the melting snow. They were shining. I'm tired, Rafe, she said, her voice catching. "I'm so tired of defending, of fighting, of being on my guard." He turned to face her, his expression softening. "Then let me make an attack." And there, on the top step of the federal courthouse, with the wind and the snow swirling around them and the entire town of Cheyenne watching, Rafe Calder went down on one knee. He did not pull out a ring. He reached into his coat and pulled out a single, heavy iron key. It was old and worn, the key to the south barn at Calder Mesa, the one that faced her land. He held it out to her. "This isn't a fence line. Marietta, this is a gate. Come home, to our home, together." The crowd fell silent, their cheers dying in their throats. It was a proposal as raw and real as the land they stood on. Marietta looked at the key, then at the man kneeling before her in the snow. A slow, brilliant smile spread across her face. She reached down, not to take the key, but to take his hand, pulling him to his feet. She stood on her toes, her face close to his. She took his hand, the one that had held the key, and placed it on her own cheek. She guided his rough, calloused fingers along the line of her jaw, up to her temple, and then down the side of her neck, letting him feel the frantic, joyful pulse that beat there. Her breath plumed white in the cold air as she whispered, the words for him alone. "Kiss me there again." He did. He lowered his head and kissed her. A firm, warm, and certain kiss that claimed her in front of God and the whole world. It was a kiss that lasted long enough for the stunned silence of the crowd to break into a wild, whooping cheer. His other arm went around her waist, pulling her tight against the solid warmth of his coat. A gesture of respect, of protection, of public, undeniable love. The crowd erupted. The cowboys from Calder Mesa threw their hats in the air. Elsie Dorr let out a piercing whistle. Even Pastor Whitcomb, standing on the edge of the crowd, gave a small, dry cough, and then a single, approving nod. Deputy Higgins grinned, turning to the man beside him. "Well," he said, "the deed for the land is settled. Looks like the deed for the heart just got signed." "Two." Marietta pulled back from the kiss, her eyes shining. She looked up at Rafe, her smile mischievous. "Let's go back to Juniper Flats," she said, her voice full of laughter. "That new roof beam is still missing a kiss." He threw his head back and laughed, a deep, genuine sound of pure joy. They walked down the stone steps, his arm around her, her head on his shoulder. Their two shadows stretched out behind them, a single, long line on the fresh, white snow. The door to the south barn at Calder Mesa swung open, spilling a shaft of late afternoon sun into the quiet, fragrant darkness. The air inside smelled of sweet hay, old leather, and cedar. Marietta pulled Rafe into the golden light. She reached up with her calloused fingertips and tilted his face down to hers. He kissed her slowly, deeply, right on the pulse point of her neck, the very spot she had asked for. When his lips finally left her skin, he looked into her eyes. "From now on," he said, his voice a low, rough promise, "every north wind will be warmed by your name." Her sharp, indrawn breath was all the yes he needed. And as the great wooden door swung closed, the only sound was the wind, singing its lonely, wild song over the plains of Juniper. Thank you so much for listening to our story. If you enjoyed this journey to the Old West, please let us know where in the world you're listening from in the comments below. We love hearing from you and sharing our thoughts. Please subscribe to our channel. Wild West Stories 1850, give this video a like. And if you'd really like to support us, hit that hype button to help this story reach more listeners.